And thank you everyone for attending. So today we're going to go through the sports nutrition strategies for our athletes who are going to the Olympics, and we're going to focus mainly on the Olympic year. And by the end of this session, you're going to have an idea about nutrition periodization. So what we're going to focus around is more about the training periodization, and in parallel the nutrition strategies that go around that. And we will recommend a few performance and injury prevention strategies and guidelines. So sports nutrition has gone a long way since the first Olympics, and this is something that we need to think about. And even since the ancient Greek Olympics. So there was a record recently in a dissertation that quotes that the athletes were amateurs back then. And mainly they were having wine like the ancient Greeks, and they still believed that eating a goat's leg would give you the power of a goat. So I'm pretty glad that we had a consensus statement in 2019, and we know that right now we do have nutrition strategies for our athletes to help them out in the Olympics. But there's something that we need to think about. Like Pythagoras was the first to have trained athletes on a meat diet. And formerly athletes had trained on dried figs, moist cheese, and wheat. So it makes us think that these athletes were mainly eating whatever was available. And this is something we need to think about, because nowadays there is a lot of food available. And with a multitude of FMCGs, it might be a bit confusing for our athletes. So our role is to guide them throughout that key year. And the training periodization that we're going to talk about is going to go through 3 major cycles. So a training year can have a macro cycle, so that's the full year or the 4 years that lead to the Olympics. And then this is broken down into a mesocycle, so it's about 2 to 3 months of training, and that has key competitions around it. So this is where we tailor more our strategies. And then you do have the mesocycle, it's broken into microcycles. So each of these blocks of 2 to 3 months are broken down into weeks of training. So this is where we refine even more our nutritional strategies. So it will give you something like that. So this is a full year, and what you see above is the macro phase broken down into the weeks. And what I like to focus on right now is that we're going to focus on the general preparation phase, or the preseason. And you will see that we have a few goals, and one of them, the main one, is to actually meet the energy needs. And this is something that we see quite frequently when we are screening our athletes, that we see there is a risk of low energy availability. So what we want to focus on during that Olympic year is that energy availability is met every day during their micro phase. And moving on from the general preparation, you see that there are local competitions. So this is how we break it down into cycles of 2 to 3 months. And here we would be aiming at meeting the competition needs, and aiming also at meeting the recovery strategies, because if you see the calendar of the athletes, they do have like multiple competitions one after the other, or they have travel. So also at that point, we need to think about the travel nutrition strategies, and also how to support their immune process. And at the end, you see at the last transition, which is kind of like the off season or a transition in between competition, this is where the training goes lower, and this is where we would still want to support recovery strategies, because they are still doing some kind of training, but also we need to think about the off season and how the body composition changes. So this is what we're going to talk about mainly today. And 2 things that we need to think about and keep in mind. You know, we have all this science and all these strategies, but we need to think that our athletes are really individual. So we cannot go by a book or by numbers. They do have, let's say, similar calendars, but at the end of the day, their needs are different. And also their periodized nutrition is going to be different. So giving them a simple meal plan or a paper it's not going to help out. It's not going to cut it through. We need to tailor it. So a few things to think about. Let's start with the preseason. And we do have some challenges. The main one is the injury prevention, because during the preseason, we focus on an increased volume of training, and at the same time, there's a reduced intensity training. So this is where we do see an increase in the injury. And in terms of nutritional strategies, we can work around injury prevention. And at the same time, we need to ensure that they have an appropriate energy intake that is matching their energy expenditure. So if they have an increased volume, not only they need more energy and more food for this training, but also their basic metabolic rate is going to increase by the end. So as well, they're going to be needing more energy. And at the same time, we need to think about body composition. I'm going to be realistic. Preseason is a time where you do see in clinic a lot of athletes being referred for body composition. If you are working with an Olympic athlete, preparation does not mean weight loss during the preseason. This needs to be done in advance, so at least we need to start working during the off season. But yes, we can do some optimization of body composition during the preseason, because the main challenge is that they have this high training volume and they have to get that high energy intake. So it's quite challenging to optimize the body composition fully. You cannot do more than a 4% change. Even 4% is pretty too much for the preseason. And I'm glad to say that there has been recently an introduction of body composition best practice guidelines. And basically it goes about the professional level of the athlete. So at the bottom you have the developing athletes, so mainly these are our adolescent athletes, and in terms of nutritional management we just need to match them with their skills. So it's a foundational practice that we give them. It's more about the basics of nutrition. And then in the middle part you have the national and collegiate level athletes. So this is where we start developing their sports nutrition knowledge and we give them more practices about periodization, etc. What I want to focus around is that at the end you have, at the top you have the elite and professional athletes. So obviously our Olympic athletes are there, and even though they are at the top and they have refined nutritional skills, body composition cannot be done without a specific purpose, and it should be done only in the case where you have athletes with a positive body image. So that's why we do have those best practice guidelines. And at the end, when you're going to do the body composition, we need to do something with these numbers. So it has to be related with a specific goal and a specific objective. So moving on to the objectives. So we know what are our challenges, what are the objectives during the preseason. So obviously it's to ensure a high fueling availability, to support the training volume and minimize the weight gain at the same time, and to avoid extreme dieting behavior. So it goes to the same focus that we were discussing. So again, preseason is not the optimal time for weight loss for an Olympic athlete. Now, we talked a lot about the energy needs of our athletes during the preseason. So these are some numbers. 30% is the caloric deficit that we see. So our track and field athletes specifically show that they are having at least 30% less than their needs. And this is a huge number, because on the long term, it will affect them clinically. It can also be an indirect cause of an injury that is non-impact. And we do have gender differences as well within the track and field athletes. When we talk about the energy availability, females require at least 40 kcal per kg of fat-free mass, so per kg of muscle mass, let's say, while the cutoff line for male is 55 kcal per kg. And we're going to see some numbers later on. And at the end of the day, we need to think about the concepts, and not only concepts, but we need to analyze if our athletes and rule out if there's any energy availability, low energy availability, or any symptoms of relative energy deficiency in sports, especially during those loads of high of fluctuation. And we need to think also about that our athletes are undergoing at least 12 hours of training per week during the preseason. So they might have double sessions 3 to 4 times a week. And that might account for a total of 9 to 14 sessions of training per week. So this is why we see an increase in energy expenditure. And at the same time, we need to maintain the energy availability as we discussed. So what about energy availability? I don't know if a lot of you heard about it, but in our discipline, this is something that we're quite talking about it since we had the recent consensus statement on the REDS. So should we measure it or should we not measure it? Because it's not something that you can directly measure, actually. It's an equation that requires a few variables. You need to know your athlete's energy intake, and this is quite difficult to measure. A research setting is different than a clinical setting, but let's talk about a clinical setting. Energy intake is going to be fluctuating day to day. There's going to be under-reporting or over-reporting. Even if you give them a diary, your athletes are pretty busy doing other important things, so they're not going to stick with that diary. And then you do have to measure the exercise energy expenditure. So yes, you can use smartwatches, you can use GPS trackers, but is it something that you can literally do in a clinical setting? And then you're going to have to measure the fat-free mass. Well, fat-free mass is easy because you're going to use either a bioelectrical impedance analyzer or you're going to be using a DEXA scan if it's available. So the concept of measuring energy availability is quite difficult, but at the end of the day, we need to know if our athlete is exposed to a low energy availability, if it might impact the performance directly. And on the long run, it might also affect the relative energy deficiency in sport. So I'll give you a quick overview about the REDS. It's a syndrome of impaired physiological and or psychological functioning. So it could be physiological or it could be psychological or both. So we need to be really attentive to our athletes when we're seeing them, and it can be experienced by both genders. In the past, we used to think that it's only females, and it's caused by exposure to a problematic low energy availability. So this is the difference that has come out in this consensus, is that the low energy availability can be something chronic or it can be something acute. And if it's problematic, it means it's chronic, and you're going to start seeing symptoms of REDS. So who is at risk? Of course, weight-sensitive events, people that are engaging in middle and long distance sports, power-to-weight ratio athletes like high jump and pole vault, and those athletes that have a high exercise energy expenditure. So we need to think about the combined event, heptathlon, endurance events. And as you've seen, I put a lot of pictures of females. So obviously females are also at risk for the relative energy deficiency in sport. And the thing is, you can't really pinpoint it to a specific sports discipline in track and field because the variation and the prevalence is really different. So it can range between 18 to 58% prevalence within a discipline. And even 18% is quite a number. And one last thing about the REDS is that what are the physiological aspects, or what are the most symptoms that we can see clinically? So here I pinpointed what I personally see in the clinic. So we think about the impaired growth and development. We do see impaired glucose and lipid metabolism, and we do see the energy metabolism that is affected, and reduced skeletal muscle function. So in very, very simple terms, your athlete will tell you, I'm tired. That's it. And you rule out all the other clinical aspects, and you can try to assess the energy availability and see if it's chronic, and combine it to other symptoms as well, and evaluate if there's any REDS. If you do need more information around that, you can check the IOC consensus statement and scan the QR code. So these are mainly our main challenges during the preseason. But also we discussed that there might be any training camps during that period. There is a high load also of training. So we need to think about the immunonutrition and the injury prevention. One key aspect that we see clinically is that our athletes are screened. And mainly this is during the preseason, so where you see those red arrows, and also somewhere around the end of the general preparation phase. And also in between competition. So this is a good key evaluator to see if there are any deficiencies that can be indicated, because the periods of extended and intense training can increase the incidence of illness, and we need to think about deficiencies like iron as well. And this is relatively a sign also of a low intake. But also we need to think about the stress fractures in terms of injury prevention, and this is one of the very few direct, let's say, effects that nutrition can have. So on the long run, if your athletes are having a low intake of calcium and a vitamin D deficiency, they need to be screened for these variables and for the thyroid function as well. And Energy balance is also a component of that, complex injury that we see, and we need to see about their protein intake as well. So it's not only about calcium, it's not only about vitamin D. When we have a stress fracture, we need to check if their needs are okay in terms of energy and in terms of protein. So moving on to the fueling and bulking plan. So we nailed down their energy. We perfected, let's say, the energy intake, and now we need to make sure that they're eating enough for the work that they're going to do. 3 components are involved in that. So protein needs, this is a macronutrient that everyone talks about. So what we work on is having enough protein for the muscle protein synthesis and making sure that it's rightly distributed during the day. This is what we call periodization. And in terms of when they have those bouts of high or double sessions during the days, we favor bedtime protein intake as well. Carbohydrate fueling is another factor. So it's not only about having enough carbohydrate, it's about when to take carbohydrate. And it really depends on the discipline, because some disciplines are difficult in terms of time management and resource access. So having enough carbs before, during, and after. And I know it's very simple to say it, but we do see athletes that are only having carbs after. So it does impact their performance. And also one key aspect specifically in endurance is training the gut. So you need to train the gut to take a specific amount of carbohydrate for the fueling during the event, and this can take quite a while to understand what type of carbohydrate is okay in terms of GI comfort. And last, it's the timing and frequency. So as I've said, there are some disciplines that are challenging in terms of time management. So sometimes we do favor a higher caloric intake and a higher carbohydrate intake at specific times in terms of breakfast and pre-training. And we do favor easily digestible foods and foods that are fast absorbed. So these are actually favoring the training adaptation strategies. So if we look at the specific disciplines, I'm going to focus on the track and field disciplines. So first, in terms of jumps, their main aim during the preseason is to develop the peak power to weight. And sometimes we do see a gradual fat loss that is actually not planned, but because of the high training load. So here during the preseason, we favor a frequent carb intake and we aim on the fueling and recovery mainly. These are the key strategies. In terms of sprints and hurdles, they do share some key aspects with the combined events. So when I'm discussing combined events, it's more of the longer or ultra events. So like the decathlon and heptathlon. So here we see a high volume of training during the preseason, and both of these disciplines, they are the ones that have a limited time and resource management. So this is where you see the athlete mainly on the track having double sessions, long sessions, so it's quite difficult to get to an area where they can grab food or a shake. So here we would be also favoring frequent carb intakes and the fueling and recovery. While throws, we try to aim for a moderate muscularity during the preseason, and we need to think about the type of training that they have. So this is where they're going to have repeated throws. So they will be having increased energy demand, but the carb need, contrary to what we think, is actually low to moderate, so it's not high, because when you see a thrower, you see a different kind of muscularity, and we tend to think that they have much higher needs in terms of carb. So in terms of preseason, we've discussed the challenges. Let's move on to the pre-competition and the pre-event. There are 2 key aspects in these phases, is that most of the time we will not be with our athletes on the event day, so we need to make sure that they understand what kind of foods are available and are comfortable and are good for their performance. And during the competition phase, I'd like to do a comparison between the competition phase and the preseason phase in terms of discipline. So jumps, moving on to the competition phase, their training will focus more on specific skills. So the only difference would be a reduced carbohydrate need. And the sprints and hurdles and combined events, they will also have a lower training volume and the more sport-specific training during the pre-competition phase. So this is where we need to specify and filter through the gut training. So during a specific long session, more than 90 minutes, our athletes are supposed to be taking 60 to 120 grams of carbohydrates for optimized performance. And every athlete has a threshold. And it's important to understand, what types of carbs and the number that suits them. And in terms of throws, this is where they aim for an increase in power through their training. So the energy needs will be more on the moderate side. But one thing in common that all these disciplines will have during the pre-competition phase is a key strategy called carbohydrate loading. And we've heard a lot in the past about carbohydrate loading, and it was a strategy that was done many, many days before the event, but right now the strategy changed. So we know that carbohydrate is the primary energy when we're discussing track and field disciplines, and the energy that is produced from eating carb, is much higher than fat. This is why we focus on the carbohydrate loading. And the more you have in the muscles, the better it is for performance. And actually, if there is a depletion in the storage, this is a limiting factor for your athlete. And in terms of timing, the strategy of carbohydrate loading has changed from the past. So right now, the loading is only done within 2 to 3 days pre-competition, but it needs to be combined with a reduced training intensity, which obviously does happen because pre-competition, they do reduce the training intensity. So it's the perfect time to load up more on the carb in order to have more storage in the liver and the muscles. And usually that number is quite high. It's 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight. This is quite a number, and I'll give you an example. So we're going to take a 65 kg male, and we're going to aim for a 10 gram of carb per kg of body weight per day. So that's going to give you 650 grams. So just to give you an idea, we're going to run through the day of what types of carbs will give us a total of 650 grams. And I'm going to skip the other macronutrients just to give you a better idea. So for breakfast, our athlete would have to take 2 bowls of cereal, a cup of milk, a cup of juice, a banana, 2 slices of toast, and this jam is a thick spread. It's not a thin spread. So this is on top of the proteins that they're gonna have, and this is on top of the vegetables that they're gonna give us the antioxidants. And we're gonna insert a snack. I know we do say sometimes simple sugars are not great, but honestly, when you're calculating this much carbs, it's difficult not to put a muffin. And for lunch, other than the protein and the vegetables, we're going to add a bread roll, honey, biscuit, flavored yogurt, because a flavored yogurt is actually quite higher in carbohydrates, and this is a smoothie. And then for a snack, double granola bar. And for dinner, we're going to have 3 cups of pasta, 2 cups of fruit salad, and a bottle of electrolyte and carb drink because it's more concentrated in carbs. And the bedtime snack can be something around, this is not a full bar of chocolate, this is 80 grams of chocolate. So it's quite, smaller than that. So this is a huge number when we think about it. It's not straight to the point for the athlete. It's not easy to achieve that on top of all the other demands that they have. But it would give them an advantage in terms of competition. Now, this will be done 2 to 3 days before the competition, and we need to think about the pre-event meal, so the same day meal. There are key factors that could support our athletes. So first, a lot of athletes prefer to have the intake like 3 hours, 5 hours pre-event. Optimally, it would be around 4 hours before the event, and the composition should be on the higher side of carbohydrate, moderate amount of protein, so don't take any goat leg, as we've seen at the beginning, and reduced in fat and reduced in fiber for optimal and easy digestion. We don't want them to have any tummy aches during the event. And that's the most important, especially when we're thinking about international competition. We don't want them to try anything new. It's a very simple concept, and sometimes it's challenging to apply because new foods might cause GI distress. We don't know how they're going to deal with it. So a lot of athletes also prefer to have different timings. So this is a chart that will show you around how many grams of carb they should be taking before the event. So we said if it's 4 hours before the event, it's going to be around 4 grams per kg body weight of carb. So obviously the composition will be shifting. The closer you get to the event, the less fat and the easier digestion you need your food, your pre-event meal to be. And in terms of 3 hours before the event, it's less carbohydrate. It's 3 grams per kg of body weight. And this is very interesting. When you get around 2 hours, 2 hours is pretty close to the event, you will need to combine 2 types of carbohydrate, a low glycemic index and a high glycemic index. So you want to give them an energy, provide them with a stable energy, so something that takes longer to digest. This is the lower glycemic index, and you need to provide them for an energy for the beginning of the event. So this is the high glycemic carb. And another technique also is including like high intensity bursts. We see them on the track. They have those warm-ups with high intensity bursts because this is actually kickstarting the liver to release more glycogen into the bloodstream. So if you couple it with these carbohydrate manipulation, it might benefit the athlete. So at the end of the day, we do have a lot of options, but the key is actually individualizing it because every athlete has different preferences. So the most important factors for the pre-event is to know the timing that is comfortable, to trial the foods beforehand, and trial the glycemic index as well, you know, the different types of carb. And we can also work around FODMAP, but this is more into the pre-season. So these are the types of carbs that might affect the GI comfort. And if we do have athletes that are suffering from a lot of GI challenges, so we can work around that during the season. So to give you an idea about all these numbers, what is a pre-event meal? Let's take a 70 kg male mid-distance. Event is around 3 o'clock. Our athlete prefers to have the meal 4 hours before, so that's around 11 a.m. And that would total 280 grams of carbohydrates. That's quite a number. So that's in one meal. So we're gonna add a bagel, a carb powder, because a carb powder will give you around 45 grams and it's easily digestible, a jello, a banana, you know, 2 fruits, but this is still short of 99 grams. And then you're gonna add your toast and jam. So that would be a pre-event meal, but this is just the carbohydrate component. Just to put things in perspective, it's quite hard. All right, and another strategy we need to think about during the competition is hydration. So the work needs to be done during the pre-competition season. So obviously we need to understand the climate, the weather, all of these implications that affect the sweat rate. And if the athlete has the opportunity to have the sweat rate measured in advance, that would be helpful because then we would understand how much hydration and what kinds of fluids they would require during the event. So if we're not working with the sweat rate, we can work with something simple and basic, which is the pre and post training weigh-in. So we take a representative training and we weigh our athlete just before, just after, and we calculate how much fluids they've lost during that time, and that would give us an idea about how much fluids they should be having during and before. But we do prefer that the athlete comes in a euhydration state, which means that they need to have some fluids before coming in. So that's going to be at least 400 to 700 ml, at least 60 to 90 minutes, like an hour and a half before the event. And during competition, it depends on the type of competition, but ideally it would be around 300 to 600 ml every 15 to 20 minutes, and that includes electrolyte drinks. Now, another method for athletes is to monitor their urine color, and this is very easy. The lighter the color, the more hydrated they understand that they are. The darker the color, this is a sign of dehydration, and they need to have either more electrolytes or more fluids. But developing a hydration plan for Olympic athletes is more favorable. Now, what about sports supplements? And it is the most discussed topic when we are talking about athletes going to the Olympics, and we hear a lot about protein and whey powder. So a primary concern for an athlete competing in the Olympics is taking sports supplements. But it's important to have specific guidance around that. The worst case scenario would be taking new supplements around the event and the competition phase. So if you are working with an Olympic athlete and want to support performance, what would be your first approach when we're discussing sports supplements? There's a lot of things to tackle here. You need to think about the type of supplement, you need to consider the dosage, the timing, and the distribution. But also something that we really need to consider is third-party testing. It's important to have the best chance for our athletes to succeed. We don't want them to have an ADRV. So the education starts pretty much early on before the Olympics. And when it comes to decision making, supplement intake, it's really important to weigh the risk and the benefits. On paper, we know that there are supplements that can help our athlete in a specific discipline, but we also need to test it, and we also need to consider that our athlete has done all the homework, and the homework starts at the base of the pyramid. So first we need to make sure that our athlete has a balanced diet, and then we move on to the sports nutrition strategies, so all the points that we discussed previously, and then we can provide the supplement, because the supplement is just going to give you that extra less than 1% edge, but we need to make sure that we've done everything in advance. So this is what we favor at the beginning. Now, if we want to tackle the sports supplements, these are the big five. We have the caffeine, the creatine, the nitrate, beta-alanine, and bicarbonate. And I've listed the track and field because this is our focus during this talk. So not all supplements are equal in terms of disciplines. And in terms of caffeine, we know that it does increase alertness and it reduces perception of fatigue. But one note about caffeine, it does interact negatively with a lot of other supplements. So the combination of supplements is something to think about and to trial in advance as well. In terms of creatine, it's not for all athletes in terms of track and field. So mid-distance, steeplechase, they don't need this extra bulking, and as well as long-distance runners and ultra-endurance athletes, because creatine does work more on the short-term activities, like those high bursts of activities. It helps in increasing the skeletal muscle mass, it helps in increasing the power and the strength, but some disciplines do not need this extra bulking that comes after taking the creatine, especially on a loading protocol. Now, nitrate is also favored, especially when they are going on training camps, altitude training. So it's a good time to use it, to trial it, but specifically for mid-distance and for long distance, because it also helps in improving the mitochondrial function. As for beta-alanine, we do see a lot of products right now containing beta-alanine pre-workouts, but actually beta-alanine, the best way or the optimal way to take it according to the studies is actually to do a loading protocol that needs to start at least 3 months before the event. So to get the optimal effect and to have an increase in the skeletal muscle function, a specific protocol according to the weight and the tolerance should be done at least 12 weeks before the event. And in terms of bicarbonate, it does help in the increase of power production, but specifically for 400 meters, hurdles, and mid-distance. So there's a lot to think about. So we need to think about the dosage, the trial, side effects, the timing, and sometimes it means we need to start experimenting with these and trialing them in advance, and the interaction. Now, if we put it all together, we have the privilege of working with Olympic athletes. So I've given you an example of an athlete that has been seen, and he's male, hurdle specialty, and around 180 centimeters, 83 kgs. So I'll give you a few numbers. We've worked around the caloric needs. And you see that there's a variation in the caloric needs during the season. So during an injury, the caloric needs and the energy intake will be different than during a preparation phase. And in the injury, it's not as low as what we think it should be, because our athlete still has a load. And if they have a partial immobilization, for example, they're still expanding energy. And this is, that's a point that we see a lot. Like, they get injured, they highly reduce the carb and the protein intake, but actually their needs are quite higher during that time. So during the season, you could see that there's a shifting in the demand. So protein can vary between 1.4 to 2 gram per kg of body weight. So it can reach up to 160 grams per day. And in terms of carbohydrate, it depends at which stage of the season they are. So as we've seen, a higher demand of carbohydrate is just before the event or during, for example, a training camp. So during rehab, it can go down 3 to 4 grams per kg of body weight, and pre-competition it goes up 5 to 7 grams per kg of body weight. So the timing of the nutrient consumption has the potential to have significant effects, and the amount as well. So if we look at the Olympic year of our athlete, you will see these are the timings of the encounter. So you can see that during the preseason, they might be more available, or also because of an injury, it's the best time to interact and to have our plan set out. And then in between the competition, also there's a bit of consulting that goes around there. Something we've worked around, because if you remember the pyramid, we've said that they have their basic nutrition skills and then they have their sports nutrition skills. So when you're having an Olympic athlete, most of the time you're not starting from the basic nutritional strategies or a basic meal plan. So you need to see what that athlete is doing and how is the training schedule, and then you fine tune it. So a bit of fine tuning that happens is around the protein timing and the protein amount and the carbohydrate load. It's quite frequent in track and field to see some anxiety around the body image. And carbohydrate is quite a sensitive topic for athletes, and it takes time for them to start accepting the fact that they need to hike up their carbohydrate intake. And then when they start seeing a direct effect on their performance, I think this is when they start doing the change and they start being compliant. We did as well work on the fueling and on the supplements for injury at that point, and the body composition. But the body composition, as I've said, it was only a preliminary assessment to see if it's affecting the injury, and we need to make sure that we are explaining that so that we don't increase any anxiety that comes from the body composition assessment. And then on the next, after 2 weeks, we discussed the macrocycle and the carbohydrate fueling. So this is where our athletes felt more comfortable around carbohydrate and increasing the intake. And we did shift into supplementation for performance and the loading plans that is coming during a full year. So we drafted a supplement plan for the full year. It does not mean that it will be applied, but it's just for us to have a specific outline to follow during the year. Now, in between the competition that our athlete had, we worked on recovery plan, altitude training, and there was another body composition. So this is where we saw a shift in fat mass, because in altitude training, we have a higher energy demand, higher carb demand, higher iron demand. So we did see a reduction inevitably in the fat. And we did discuss the carbohydrate load that had to change during that period of time. And going closer to the multiple events and the multiple travels that this athlete had, we had to adjust the supplement plan. Because as I've said, some supplements like beta-alanine has side effects, so we can adjust the dosage depending on that. And at the end, we did work on the carbohydrate loading protocol. So this is where we reached our pre-event discussion and the ingredients. So just to put everything in perspective and to wrap it up, there are 3 specific timelines in the Olympic year of an athlete. So coming off from the off season, we need to think about the nutrition periodization. So we look at their training plan and then we periodize accordingly in terms of strategies. But we also need to assess at that point in time our athlete knowledge. Depending on the athlete knowledge, we start building up our plan on that. And then we need to consider at that point in time the training plan, the travel plan, and body composition. During the preseason, there is more of an objective around muscle strengthening, endurance, and technical skills. So our nutritional objectives need to focus on metabolic efficiency and supporting and improving the sport-specific skills. And this is where we think about injury prevention, energy needs, if we need to assess energy availability. And these are the macronutrients. If you want more details, you can check them out in the published paper. I will put a QR code at the end because the macronutrients are really variable, interdisciplinary, and as we said, by individuals. So it's not a number that I like to focus on. And at the end of that macro cycle, we have the competition nutrition. So this is where they refine the sport-specific skills and they have an increased intensity. So our main objectives will focus on reducing muscle fatigue, improving performance, and providing the right intake for the exercise energy expenditure. And this is where the sports nutrition strategies go, like the protein periodization, the carb loading, the hydration plan. And these are the macronutrients. So you can see that in terms of macronutrients, even the fat intake will increase during that period of time, and the carb for the carbohydrate loading. So we need to remember that our athletes will be going through all these stages, and this is a summary of their nutritional implications. If you want more information, this is the QR code of the paper that we published with my colleagues.